que vous êtes en train de laisser le centre ouvert aux conservateurs en déplaçant à gauche?
Le centre ouvert.
Le centre de l'échiquier politique.
Écoutez, j'ai pas réfléchi trop, très franchement.
C'est une question importante.
Non, c'est une question importante, mais quand on... Tu sais, le commun des mortels ne pense pas au centre, gauche, droite. Il pense à ce qu'il veut accomplir. Je pense pas que les gens veulent une élection dans les 3 prochaines années. On en a déjà vécu 2 dans les 2 dernières années, avec plus ou moins le même résultat. Je pense que l'engagement qu'on a avec les néo-démocrates, c'est un engagement responsable pour avancer les enjeux qui nous sont communs. On n'a pas tous les mêmes enjeux qui nous sont communs. On a même des enjeux qui sont communs avec les conservateurs, puis ils vont pouvoir nous appuyer le cas échéant. Mais c'est une question de responsabilité, là. Donc, centre, droite, gauche, j'ai pas réfléchi trop.
Mais est-ce que vous avez peur que les dépenses deviennent hors de contrôle? Parce que...
Bien, écoutez, dans mon champ de compétences, dans les enjeux autochtones, le choix responsable, c'est d'investir davantage. Donc, étant donné, puis sachant la défense farouche des droits autochtones qu'apporte le NPD, puis que devrait porter tous les partis, ça m'encourage. Question de perspective globale sur le système fiscal canadien, toutes les dépenses, évidemment, qu'on a dû encourir pour garder les gens en vie durant la COVID, on sait tous que ça doit tirer à sa fin. Et là, c'est une question de présenter, encore une fois, un budget responsable.
Parlant des dépenses, parlant de dépenses...
I thought about the same.
Yeah, well, I mean, that this deal could alienate some blue liberals that are more fiscally conservative. They may be pushed towards the conservatives and feel they don't have an option in the center-right.
Well, I think they have to examine quite carefully what the current political leadership in the Conservative Party is offering to them. Canadians are very smart, and they'll be able to make a choice just as they did in the last 2 elections. I think what we've been told is we want stability. We have some points in common with the NDP. We have at times some points in common with the Conservatives, and they can support us should they wish to do so. I don't think anyone wakes up in the morning and asks themselves whether they're left, right, or center. It's something I think maybe a couple of us do that are talking to me right now. But you know, it's something that, you know, when you look about political calculations, I think we sort of put that to the side and said, how do we want to govern responsibly over the next 3 years for what is an ambitious agenda? And it's something that the NDP will not support us unconditionally, and everyone knows that they are not pushovers, even though people like to portray them as such, particularly among the Conservatives, but it is something that they will hold us to account. And, you know, this isn't a coalition. This is a responsible pathway forward for stability for Canadians for the next 3 years, and focusing on Canadians is what we've been saying.
What do you think about the criticisms of the fiscal responsibility? I mean, obviously, these are, like you point out, a lot of programs that are going to be ambitious, but that often means a higher budget number. So is that something that you and other caucus colleagues are concerned about at all?
Well, as I mentioned to your colleague in French, for me, responsible in the Indigenous sphere means spending more money responsibly to close socioeconomic gaps. That may come as a shock to a number of people. It shouldn't. We still have a lot of investments to be made in schools, in roads, in water investments. And Indigenous communities have said time after time, you're a minority government, you're just going to switch in a couple of years, how can we trust you? So in that particular aspect of it, it is a good, stable document to ensure support from the NDP in issues that are near and close to them. I don't think reconciliation should be a partisan issue. But when it comes to the balance sheet of the country, we've had to spend money to keep people alive during the pandemic. I think that was a smart thing to do. The mortality rates are way lower than they are in comparable countries. But now I think Canadians are looking for a responsible budget, and I think that's precisely what the Minister of Finance will present shortly.
En tant que ministre du Québec, il y a la ministre du Québec qui craint les empiètements, M. Miller.
Merci, Raymond.
Est-ce que vous avez peur qu'avec cette nouvelle entente que vous avez avec le NPD, le gouvernement fédéral devienne trop centralisateur? Je sais que c'est une crainte de certaines provinces.
Ben moi, premièrement, je pense que cette entente nous permet de faire ce qu'on veut faire, c'est livrer pour les Canadiens, puis c'est ça que je vais faire. Merci.
Are you worried you might lose some more conservative liberals, let's just say, with this new deal, that might feel that your party is moving too much to the left at this point?
I am all for stability and certainty. One thing I've learned in this racket is that we're all human beings. You only have so much time in a day. the more time you spend on what my grandmother used to call old foolishness, you know, the less time you're actually governing and moving policy forward. So I'm delighted for stability.
Là, vous entendez au sujet justement des champs de compétences. Madame Lebel à Québec vient de faire une sortie en règle pour dire qu'elle craint les empiètements fédéraux sur les champs de compétences du Québec avec des programmes que vous voulez lancer avec le NPD. Qu'est-ce que vous répondez, Madame Lebel?
Qu'on est là pour collaborer. Collaboration, la main tendue, comme toujours, vous savez. On a fait une campagne complète là-dessus. Là. On a parlé de ce qu'on voulait faire lors de la dernière campagne électorale. Notre chef en a parlé lors des débats. Moi, j'en ai parlé régulièrement aussi. Il n'y a pas de secret là-dedans. Ce qu'on veut, c'est travailler avec les provinces, et en particulier avec le Québec, pour améliorer les soins de santé. Là.
Les soins dentaires, c'est le job du fédéral, ça?
Bien, nous, ce que l'on veut, c'est collaborer avec les provinces là-dessus. C'est quelque chose d'important. J'étais chez le dentiste la semaine dernière. Là. Je ne sais pas s'y aller régulièrement, guys, là, mais ça coûte cher. Ça coûte cher, mais des familles qui n'ont pas les moyens, puis soit qu'ils s'endettent ou des fois, ils ne vont pas. Alors,
est-ce que le Québec aura droit de retrait avec pleine compensation?
Faudrait voir comme il va y avoir des discussions là-dessus, comme sur les autres points. Mais on est très flexible. Regardez l'ensemble des dossiers. Si on regarde les garderies, si on regarde d'autres dossiers, on est extrêmement flexible. Ce qu'on veut, c'est arriver à l'objectif final en collaboration avec les provinces.
Est-ce que le Québec devra avoir un programme d'assurance dentaire?
Bien là, il faudrait voir ce qu'eux souhaitent faire, mais il va y avoir des discussions entre nous et eux, ça c'est sûr. Mais ce qui est bon, c'est que ça profite à la population. On regarde les jeunes de 12 ans et moins qui en ont besoin et qui n'ont pas accès.
Les discussions commencent quand? Parce que c'est promis pour 2020.
Bien là, les ministres vont discuter entre eux, là. Peut-être pas un matin, là, mais ça s'en vient.
Est-ce que vous avez peur que votre parti se déplace trop à gauche et laisse le centre ouvert aux conservateurs?
Non, vous savez, on en fait grand cas là, de ça, là, mais il faut regarder ce que c'est. C'est une entente sur les choses sur lesquelles on s'entend. Alors, les changements climatiques, c'est-tu à gauche ou à droite? Non, c'est la bonne chose à faire. Quiconque est responsable va travailler là-dessus, des meilleurs soins de santé en collaboration avec les provinces, des meilleurs congés de maladie pour nos travailleurs. Il me semble que c'est la chose à faire, ça. Fait qu'on s'entend là-dessus avec le NPD, on va le faire. Sur d'autres choses, on ne s'entendra pas. Il va falloir qu'on trouve un autre partenaire pour gagner le vote.
Madame Lebel, vous la rassurez ce matin? Vous la rassurez?
J'espère.
Bonjour, Mme Joly.
Allô, comment ça va?
Ça va très bien.
Oui.
Quel est le message? Qu'est-ce que M. Trudeau peut encore annoncer lors de son voyage en Belgique au cours des 2 prochains jours?
Bien, M. Trudeau est au Parlement européen. Il aura l'occasion de parler à tous les parlementaires qui siègent au Parlement européen. Et non seulement il fera cela, mais il aura l'occasion de parler aussi avec le président Biden et les autres leaders du G7, parce qu'il y aura bien entendu une rencontre de l'OTAN, mais également une rencontre du G7. Et du reste, je l'ai dit hier, il y aura d'autres sanctions qui vont être annoncées au cours des prochains jours.
Et ça va être quoi le message, l'essentiel du message de M. Trudeau? Qu'est-ce qu'il peut annoncer de plus à part des sanctions? Parce que l'aide militaire, tout le monde s'entend pour dire que le Canada est rendu à court peut-être de matériel qu'on peut envoyer.
Mais on l'a toujours dit, il y a 2 choses à faire dans ce conflit pour aider l'Ukraine, c'est certainement avoir plus de sanctions et offrir davantage d'armes. C'est ce que le Canada fait, c'est ce que ses alliés font. Et du reste, le rôle du Canada dans cette crise, c'est certainement d'être ce pays qui aide à faire le pont entre l'Europe et les États-Unis, et certainement aussi les Britanniques. Alors, c'est l'idée de ce sommet, c'est certainement de continuer la très forte unité de l'OTAN et de l'Occident.
What discussions have there been for, medical aid, humanitarian aid right now for Ukraine? Like sending doctors, sending medical supplies. Obviously, we've had lots of discussions. And I'm sure that you're going to get this question about lethal aid and non-lethal aid, but like there's humanitarian aid that might be needed right now. Is there been discussions about that?
The goal is to make sure that we provide lethal and non-lethal aid. Like I mentioned, Minister Anand is working on this. Minister Sajjan also is working along with the different UN agencies by providing help and $200 million to support humanitarian efforts in Ukraine, but also outside Ukraine, as we know that at this point we're more than 3 million. There is more than 3 million Ukrainian refugees in Europe, and especially in the neighboring countries next to Ukraine. So that means Poland, Romania, Moldova, and bit by bit they're going to Germany and Western Europe.
Have there been discussions to charter flights, like we saw with Syrian refugees?
I've had conversations with many of my counterparts to see how we can make sure that we can bring Ukrainian refugees to Canada, and also Minister Fraser has been really working on this. We have this very important and novel way of bringing Ukrainian refugees through the work visa program, which was announced last week. And I know my colleague is working to make sure that Ukrainians can definitely come to Canada, because Canada will play its part, and we will work also with the Ukrainian community here.
Sur l'entente que vous avez signée avec le NPD, qu'est-ce que vous répondez aux libéraux peut-être plus centristes ou de centre-droit qui sont en train de se dire, mon Dieu, les dépenses sont en train de devenir hors de contrôle là, au gouvernement? Là, on annonce encore de nouvelles dépenses, de nouveaux programmes alors qu'on sort de la COVID.
Bien, premièrement, on avait des engagements électoraux, on a des lettres de mandat en tant que ministre, et on va respecter nos engagements électoraux. La ministre Freeland travaille sur un budget. Il y aura plus d'informations qui vont être données au cours des prochains jours et des prochaines semaines sur cette question-là. Ce que je vous dirais, par contre, de façon générale, c'est que l'objectif du gouvernement, c'est d'offrir de la stabilité dans des temps qui, on le sait, sont très difficiles. On le sait présentement qu'il y a une guerre en Europe. On le sait aussi qu'on fait face encore à la pandémie. Donc, d'avoir cette approche-là avec le NPD va pouvoir nous assurer de pouvoir prendre des décisions importantes pour le pays au même moment où on fait face à des moments difficiles.
Vous étiez coprésidente de la campagne. Pourquoi vous l'avez pas promis, des soins dentaires ou ce genre de choses qui est annoncé hier?
Mais je pense que l'objectif présentement, c'est de pouvoir justement livrer la marchandise pour les Québécois, pour les Canadiens, certainement au niveau de l'abordabilité, certainement au niveau des changements climatiques et aussi sur toutes les questions en lien avec la sécurité. Ça, c'était les 3 piliers de notre campagne. On va continuer à les respecter, à y travailler. Mais maintenant, je pense que l'objectif, c'est de pouvoir faire en sorte qu'on puisse s'attarder sur les priorités des Canadiens au même moment où on gère plusieurs crises en tant que gouvernement, mais aussi de concert avec d'autres gouvernements occidentaux.
Sur l'assurance d'emploi, M. Legault a dit à Québec ce matin qu'il s'attend un bras de fer entre Ottawa et les provinces, parce que lui, il veut pleine compensation, un droit de retrait avec pleine compensation. Est-ce que ça va être le cas? Est-ce qu'il va y avoir un bras de fer? Vous réagissez comment?
Bien, moi, je pense que quand Québec et Ottawa s'entendent, c'est les Québécois qui gagnent. Nous, de notre côté, on veut toujours s'entendre. On va voir si le gouvernement Legault va vouloir s'entendre. Donc,
sorry, just in English on the
yes.
deal. Obviously, is this something that might be difficult to sell to some of your voters who are concerned about fiscal restraint when it comes to the government of this?
Well, we've said it clearly in the last election that we had clear commitments regarding affordability, regarding climate change, and clearly also security of Canadians. We'll continue to deliver on these priorities, and we know that we as a country need stability while we're facing many crises, definitely a war in Europe as well as the pandemic. So this is the time to make sure that we continue to deliver for Canadians while dealing with unprecedented challenges.
Your dance partner, Mr. Singh, is not necessarily a fan of more military spending. That hasn't really been a commitment that you've had in this deal. Is that going to be something that you can guarantee in the next budget? That this is a thing that is needed. We've heard from defense experts. You know, obviously the Russian threat is a real thing, and you're dealing with it all the time. But you don't have the partner that you have in Parliament to get through your legislative agenda is not interested in raising your military budget. What are you going to do about that?
Well, a couple of things on that. You've heard me. I've said what I thought about making sure that we can protect Canada and support our armed forces. So you have my position. Minister of Finance is working also on the issue. She'll have more to say in the coming days and weeks, obviously, as she's preparing the budget. And I think at the same time, I think this agreement is important for stability. And meanwhile, when I look at what's going on with the Conservative Party, clearly, you know, they're not about occupying the center right now.
Est-ce qu'on peut s'attendre à ce que l'Ukraine ait un fort impact dans le budget?
Mais l'Ukraine, tout a changé le 24 février dernier. La géopolitique mondiale a changé. Donc, on en prend acte. Et certainement, comme gouvernement, on va prendre des décisions en lien avec ce qui se passe en Europe, mais ce qui se passe aussi de façon générale dans le monde.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Are you worried about losing voters to the Senate with this deal with the NDP?
Who am I speaking with? Over here? Hey, Kevin, how are you? No, look, at the end of the day, I think the agreement in principle is going to buy time for Parliament to be able to work on the things that matter to Canadians. My concern would lie at the fact that as we come out of the pandemic, and there has been significant government spending to get us through the pandemic, I think rightfully so, We're going to have to balance those social programs and that additional structural spending at a time that interest rates could be rising. I think it's going to be extremely incumbent on the government to be focused on economic growth, to be focused on finding a way to make those programs sustainable over time. So I think in principle, the programs are good. You'd be hard-pressed to find Canadians that don't agree with those types of elements. My concern lies at how do we make sure that they're sustainable fiscally over time.
Are those concerns of your constituents? Are they worried about the affordability, sustainability of things like dental care that they didn't vote for?
Well, my constituents wouldn't have 100% agreement in all areas, right? My job is to try to bring their values back to Parliament here. I think it's fair to say that my constituents would expect that the government has a plan to make those sustainable over time, such that if they are introduced, there's a way to make sure that they can continue and that they're sustainable in a fiscal sense, and especially given the challenge that we've had over the past 2 years, the prospect of increasing interest rates from the Bank of Canada. Now's the time, if we do want to have that conversation about increased social programming, we also have to have a robust conversation on economic growth and the ways that government can afford this over time.
How do you expand government spending when the inflation's already at all-time highs?
Yeah.
Certainly, the government has been borrowing to be involved in to make sure that we had support for Canadians during the pandemic. Those are always available to government at this time. But again, right now with the economic situation, commodity prices are high, oil prices are high. Those are going to create additional revenues for government. But when we're talking about structural spending over time, I really think it's incumbent on the government to be focused on economic growth and the revenue generation to pay for what we're talking about in that agreement that you've seen this week with the NDP. And that will be my role as a member of Parliament, to work with my colleagues here in the Government Caucus to have those important discussions.
Are you worried about overspending?
Look, I think at the end of the day, the principle that I would leave with you is that these are good programs. I don't think there's anything in that agreement that either wasn't, I shouldn't say wasn't, enunciated in our program, but whether it be housing, whether it be climate change, improving and working on healthcare, those are things that this government had been talking about, coming into the election in September 2021. My focus is that if we're going to move on those programs and expand them, including dental and the prospect of pharmacare, we have to be cognizant of how they're paid over time.
Yeah, but with the inflation that we're seeing right now, is this really a good time for the government to be spending more? Because part of the reason why we have inflation is also because of the important government spending we've seen.
I was in the House yesterday, and I think it's an interesting policy conversation now about whether or not, particularly around affordability, whether or not government is going to increase spending to try to support individuals who are vulnerable, or whether or not there has to be, a receding of government spending to try to curb inflation. It's a challenge. I mean, if you look back historically, it's not an easy issue to tackle. I know it'll be at the forefront of the conversations in the days ahead. My emphasis and the point I want to make today is that I think in principle this is a good agreement that gives stability for parliamentarians to work on the things that matter, but we need to have a robust conversation on how we make this sustainable within the fiscal framework.
Do you speak French?
Oui, un peu.
Est-ce qu'on peut essayer une question en français?
OK.
Est-ce que vous avez peur que le parti se déplace trop vers la gauche et qu'il dépense trop et qu'on perde des électeurs au Parti conservateur?
Oui, dans ma circonscription de Kingshands en Nouvelle-Écosse, je pense pour la plupart de mes citoyens sont centristes et vous, un gouvernement et un parlement bilan. Mais je pense maintenant le plus important piece, et c'est pour le gouvernement si les programmes sociaux sont augmentés avec l'entente avec le MPD. C'est aussi nécessaire pour une robuste conversation concernant la croissance de l'économie et le revenu nécessaire pour s'assurer que ces programmes sont durables. Okay, very good. Thank you.
Well, I've said I think it's exciting that we will have stability in government. These are very important times in terms of all the work that needs to happen to rebuild post-pandemic with the growing international crisis, that we have stability so the government can do the big things that it ran on.
Your running is a very close race usually between the Liberals and the NDP. Are you concerned about going to constituents in 3 years' time and trying to make the argument that the Liberals are different?
I read on a very robust plan, a platform to deliver for our communities, to build a more inclusive Canada, to make sure that those who are marginalized in our communities have the kind of support they need. They elected me on that, and this is an opportunity to deliver on that.
Okay, thank you. Just wondering what you make of the deal. You've been obviously a Liberal for a long time. This is the first time you guys have ever signed a deal with the NDP like this?
And that's me being a Liberal for a little longer. I think it's just simply a holding deal, a stabilization deal, nothing more, nothing less.
Are you concerned about some of the spending that's in this deal, the pharmacare plan and the dental care plan? These are things that were excluded from the Liberal platform purposely.
No question there will be spending challenges, and you layer onto that our security challenges. We need some pretty serious refreshment of military funding, and so yeah, I don't envy the finance minister trying to reconcile all of these sometimes irreconcilable class.
What do you make of the dance partner of this deal, Mr. Singh, really not talking and committing to increasing defense spending?
Well, if you don't have security, you don't have anything. And I think that's been demonstrated both here in Ottawa in the last few weeks and months, and similarly in Ukraine. And as of February 24th, the world changed, and Canada's priorities and government priorities will have to change with it.
But are you concerned that the stability you're talking about, is that a potential way to undermine it if he's not going to be on board with this?
So also will be all kinds of other things. So it'll be part of the mix. I get that. But I have to say, at the Defense Committee, the NDP member has been very, very supportive of the threat analysis and readiness report. So it'll be a debate.
Mr. Singh seemed pretty convinced that the 2% of GDP would not happen. Do you know why it would be that convinced?
Well, it's an aspirational target. We're at 1.4, and even within the 1.4, there's some spending that was set out in strong here and engaged, that's been pushed off. About $5 billion has lapsed in the last 3 cycles. So I think that if I had a number one ask, it is that the procurement cycle needs to be rationalized, needs to be speeded up. Things can be done in an emergency. We saw Afghanistan. Military spending ramped up quite quickly when there was a threat, and then fell off towards the latter end of the Harper era. And I think that this event, the Ukrainian event, will move that urgency up to level. And I just say, we can't delay this stuff any longer. Russia has militarized the Arctic, and we cannot not respond. And so when we talk about, what we need to do to replace the DEW line, it's serious money. It is very serious money. And every one of us here is affected by the cyber attacks that have happened to us on a regular basis. Russia's run by a kleptocracy. It's a mafia shakedown every time they run one of these things. So every one of us here is in this quote-unquote war. And so we're being forced into choices that probably this time last year we probably wouldn't want to make.
How would you describe the overall caucus reaction to the arrangement with the New Democrats?
I'd say relatively positive. Yeah.
Only relatively?
We have a lot of relatives. Yeah.
Relatively negative.
No, I think.
Yeah. What do you mean by this? Is there some dissatisfaction, some concern, you think, inside the?
Well, every MP looks at any kind of a deal as to how does this affect me. So I think after about 24 hours of reflection, most members have come to the conclusion it's really not got much impact on me. So.
Can I ask you about a totally different topic? 3 weeks ago, there was this vote on the Bloc Québécois motion on the Quebec representation. I believe you voted against. Can you just explain to me why?
Just my usual liberal outlier thing.
I just want to hear it.
No, I take the view that you're being asked to water the vote of my constituents in Scarborough-Guildwood. And I don't know why a vote in Quebec, in effect, becomes more valuable than a vote in Scarborough-Guildwood. And so that was my reasoning.
On the financial side, of this deal, are you concerned that those constituents in Scarborough-Guildwood wanted to see a more fiscally responsible government than they'll get as a result of this deal?
I think they'll get just reading the same signals that you read from the Minister of Finance. This is going to be a fiscally very, very tight budget, she has got immense challenges. Like nothing but it may be relatively uptight, but
seriously,
A tight budget, given all the promises.
No, there's no question, but the numbers are a huge challenge. The requests are a huge challenge. I once sat at the table looking with Mark Hardy, of all people, and Ralph Goodale looking at the supply and the tables, and the demands far exceed, even back then, far exceeded the revenues. That's just the way it is.
Can you explain, just where you understand your point, when you say relatively supportive, what are the potential concerns?
Well, you probably don't know them until you get there. But as I say, most members look at it, well, how does this affect me? And I think a lot of them have just concluded that it probably doesn't affect them.
Okay, just go back to the Quebec thing.
Oh, that's where we always go.
Sorry, but the government said that they would propose something to alleviate the concerns in Quebec. So what have you heard so far, and are you concerned about the measures that could be brought forward to?
I haven't heard anything, so I'm not concerned about anything at this point.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
Mr. McKay.
Thanks. Okay.
Are you got a happy bunch in there or a reluctant bunch? How would you describe it?
I think everyone's very, very enthusiastic and about the possibility of continuing to deliver for Canadians. We're obviously living in a time where Canadians are looking to their government for stability, for predictability, and I know that ministers and the entire caucus are very, very focused on that.
You got some of the Democrats you're counting on, though, for that stability, who said some pretty rough things about your government over the last couple of years. I mean, do you think everyone's happy to set aside those sort of personal differences?
In a minority parliament, we're always looking to put aside differences and work together for the benefit of Canadians, and I know that that work's going to continue. Nothing in this agreement precludes us from doing that.
Are you concerned about the financial implications of this agreement? It's a lot of new spending, and you're already, challenged by defense issues and other things.
I have a lot of confidence in Minister Freeland and the government that will bring in a budget that shows not only that we're going forward with impressive new investments that Canadians want and expect, but also a fiscally sustainable path.
Is this a way to truncate political debate in the House?
Canadians elect parliaments, and I think what you're going to see is a continuation of very robust debate in the House. Thank you.
Thank you.